Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of Cross Border Talks. We are very excited to launch the second episode when we again stay in Eastern Europe to look at the newest developments in Eastern European Union relations.
The focus of attention this time is the 17th Batumi International Conference, which gathered representatives from the EU and the three students of excellence in the Eastern Partnership, which are Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. So we are going to discuss not only about the conference, but also about the specific context in which these three countries realize their activity and the international relations that take them into consideration. So first of all, what happened at the 17th International Conference in Batumi?
Much more important what happened a few months before the conference than during the conference itself. Because the conference was a traditional annual event during which the most important challenges for Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine and their European partners were discussed. However, we need to go back in time to the end of May 2021, when three countries were officially acknowledged as the best partners of Eastern Partnership. They officially gained the status of the associated, clearly differentiating from the other three members of Eastern Partnership, that is from Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Belarus. This is a step of vital importance because for years the European Union refused to make differences between members of Eastern Partnership, even though it was clear that each of these countries follows a distinctive foreign policy, and Azerbaijan is definitely not getting closer to the European Union, nor is Belarus, nor is Armenia, while the other three were constantly declaring their readiness to integrate closely with Europe. And for Ukraine and Georgia, this has been a strategic direction over years. Why the European Union decided to accept the fact that some countries are getting closer to the community and the others are not? So far, the European Union refused to differentiate between the three most advanced students and those countries whose policy rather distanced them from the European Union than made them closer. Let us just remind that while Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia are fairly consistent in their European and transatlantic ambitions, Azerbaijan is holding its own international policy course with close relations to Turkey, first of all, with close relations to Russia as well, and with other trade partnership in Central Asia. As for Armenia, it officially joined the Eurasian Union, and Belarus, after the last protests against Alexander Lukashenko, also adopted a strong pro-Russian course and entered a coalition course with the European Union. The European Union over years did not want to differentiate between the countries because it was afraid that if the countries that are not so advanced as Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, not as pro-European, if they are like put in the second row, this will definitely discourage them from making any reforms, any progress, and from deepening their ties to the European Union. Right now, however, the European Union is seeming to think that you need to secure what can be secured. You need to encourage those European ambitions that are overtly explained and do not foster hopes for a pro-European turn in either Armenia, either Azerbaijan or Belarus. Basically, this is the course that was advocated in 2019 by European People's Party under inspiration of Lithuanian government, one of the biggest advocates of Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia's accession into European Union. However, as I said at the time, the European diplomacy was reluctant to say that some of the countries are definitely closer to the community, while the others stopped progressing. In 2021, however, the situation is much different, and there are three key factors that I wanted to point out here. The first one was the civil conflict in Belarus, which showed the European Union that its influence over Minsk is very limited and that Alexander Lukashenko has chosen for a moment a course to cooperate closely with Russia. The second factor was the conflict in Caucasus, the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, that showed that the two countries are definitely very far from any closer cooperation with the European Union, and they are now preoccupied with completely different problems. The third factor is the military conflict in Ukraine and Russian military build-up on the Ukrainian border that frightened very much the European elites in this spring. So in seeing all this, the escalation of conflicts in some of the countries and detachment from the European Union of the others, the European Union gave a clear sign that it is going to strengthen the ties to those countries who are definitely pro-European oriented. And perhaps it realizes the fiasco of Eastern Partnership in the other three.
So, what are the conclusions of the conference in this context? What does the final document say, or are there some policy initiatives which unfold after the conference?
The main priorities of the cooperation were named by Charles Michel at the conference in his opening speech, and I will just talk about them very briefly. The first one is the economic investment package. The investment plan will be supported, as he said, by 2.3 billion euros, and the European Union thus promises to mobilize even more, 17 billion euros, in both public and private investments in the region. This is, of course, connected to the pandemics. European Union suggests that it is going to help the three countries to recover their economies from the losses the pandemic caused to them. Second big issue brought by Michel is connectivity in direct sense, because the partnership is going to be focused on improving infrastructure, transport links, roads, railways. That will help the societies of the three countries get connected to European Union, that will enhance the mobility. The third point concerns reforms, and this is actually the most unclear point, because as Michel put it, good governance is the key to unlocking the benefits that liberal democracy can bring. And he also promised that the European Union is going to promote the rule of law in the three countries. This will be an extremely difficult task in countries like Ukraine and Moldova, which has been ruled by oligarchy over last years. And in fact, the European Union turned a blind eye to what was happening in them in this resort, provided the oligarchy and the political elite sponsored by the oligarchs expressed pro-European sentiments. So to sum up, the strategy of European Union towards the three countries seems to be supporting investments, supporting infrastructure projects that make societies closer to each other. And as for further political integrations, nothing decisive has been told, and I would even say nothing decisive could not have been told.
Yes, it is the EU's approach to be looking more at the economy usually, but we also know that West is larger than the EU, and the USA has strategic interest in the domain of security and the military sphere. And there are a number of signs that Ukraine, Georgia are important, maybe even Moldova are important for the USA as well. So what is the importance, in fact, of these three countries, and what is the American vision for them?
I would say that they are essential for the American strategy in Eastern Europe. Let us just look at the map where the three countries are located. We could say they are Ukraine and Georgia are key points in the strategy of deterring and containing Russia. And Moldova is also extremely important because of a frozen conflict at its borders, which I think is the issue that we will come back to in a moment. So let us remind that the US is already a strategic partner of Ukraine, that the strategic partnership was strengthened on this year's spring. Georgia and Ukraine are already enjoying a strategic partnership with the US, and the US is key ally to Ukraine in the conflict with Russia in the east of the country. And Ukrainian allies have recognized it many times, and they are constantly calling for increased American support in the military field. And the same refers to Georgia, which also is a strategic partner of the US. And this also explains why it was Lithuania in 2019 that launched the idea of like splitting the Eastern Partnership in two, because Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states, let me state this again, are the backbone of American strategy in the Eastern Europe.
But which strategy, the American or the European, is prevailing in these countries right now?
Well, this is a very important question, and let me here state once again, let me just state an obvious thing perhaps. While the strategy is directed against somebody, and this somebody in this context is Russia, and we must note that Russia has been absolutely against any efforts to see any Georgian or Ukrainian efforts to join the NATO, but it was much more willing to accept, for example, Georgians' European ambitions. It seems that for Russia it is a dogma that that NATO cannot get any further in the east, but for European integration, the Russians are not so much against. Perhaps this is a huge packages of economic support will be a weaker European Union, and this can only play for Russia's interests. It is particularly visible in the Georgian case that Russia is no longer categorically opposed to European integration of Georgia, but on the other hand, it will be always against accepting new members to NATO, any more NATO members in the East.
So Russia apparently plays a role also through the so-called frozen conflicts. In each of these countries, excellent students of the European Association have some form of frozen conflict or contested area. What is in fact the role of those frozen conflicts in this context when the EU seems to have strategic interest and tries to get those countries closer?
Indeed, frozen conflicts were in fact one of the reasons for which the integration of those countries was virtually impossible over the last decades. Let me just remind that in the beginning of the 90s, during the dissolution of the Soviet Union and in the following years, all the three countries experienced civil wars and ethnic or identity conflicts. In Moldova, I'm talking about a short, very symbolic war in Transnistria, which result was the breakaway Transnistria Republic. And in Georgia, we had conflicts in Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia. And in the case of Ukraine, there is still ongoing conflict in the Donbass and the east of the country. Well, in all the three cases, there were genuine differences between either between different peoples living in Georgia, as Abkhazians and Ossetians are distinctive nations, or an identity conflict in Moldova with the Transnistrian population wishing to keep Soviet Union alive. But nevertheless, it comes without doubt that all these conflicts were fueled by Moscow as well, and that they are still an arm in Moscow hands. In case of Moldova, it is perhaps the most visible, because of Transnistria, Moldova could not join European Union, at least for one simple reason: the Transnistrian Ukrainian border was left unsecured, and so had Romania or European Union accepted Moldova, would get an unsecured border in the package. And so for Russia, keeping the breakaway republics and keeping the frozen conflicts in place is indeed to keep free countries away from European Union, to strengthen the impression that the countries are unstable, that the countries do not have this good governance that Charles Michel talked about, and that if they are once accepted into community, then the European Union may even get a civil war within its borders. But here we need to give one more remark. Although the ruling elites of all the three countries, in fact, did not enough to solve the frozen conflicts, even if we keep the Russian interest aside for a moment. It was well explained and described in detail how did Moldovan politicians did dirty business with the representative of Transnistria, although officially the breakaway republic was only a problem for Moldova. And in Georgia, regaining control over Abkhazia and Ossetia has been virtually impossible, also because of the oligarchic system inside the country and the corruption that did not allow to solve Georgia's internal problem, not to mention encourage the people living in those unrecognized republics. And the case of Ukraine is on the best way become another Transnistria case, if it has not become already, because theoretically both sides are expressing absolute unwillingness to compromise, and on the other side there is still business ongoing between the oligarchs from Ukraine and the ones who are now based in Donetsk and Lugansk republics. So business goes beyond politics also in this dirty meaning, and this has already a part of the political landscape in all the three countries. Nevertheless, the fact that the three were accepted as the associated trio shows that the European Union is no longer thinking that the unrecognized countries are a problem not to overcome. Perhaps in the European Union, after Belarus and after what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, the elites came to thinking that it is better to strengthen cooperations with those countries where the elites are still willing to do that before those three descend into chaos, or before there comes somebody who offers another geopolitical vision for them.
And finally, our view on the Batumi conference and the regional geopolitics suffers from this problem that we are seeing it too much as geopolitical fight, this region, while in reality there are people who are living there and they have their life and they maybe have their emotions, which can also be an important issue of discussion. So do you happen to have some contacts in those countries or some feeling or sentiment from them? What is the perspective which people on individual level feel in those countries?
Well, it is a very good remark that you made. We are looking too much on geopolitics and too little on those people who actually live in the three countries, although the number of inhabitants in all three cases has been falling, and particularly Moldova, if nothing happens, will become a depopulated area even in this century, if not earlier. As we already discussed in our previous episode, also partially devoted to Moldova, this is the poorest country in Europe, one of the poorest at least, and it is losing its population at really a horrifying pace, with educated people going to look for better future in Western countries. The same happens now in Ukraine. Poland has already around 3 million Ukrainian inhabitants staying here permanently or circulating between Ukraine and Poland. The same migration processes are visible in Georgia. Sadly, in all the three countries, as I said, the fall of the Soviet Union did not bring democracy, but brought oligarchical systems, internal fightings between the oligarchs, and accumulation of capital in very few hands. And sadly, the European Union bears also some guilt in this case, because particularly in the case of Moldova and Georgia, but also Ukraine to some extent, the European Union seemed to be very satisfied with pro-European declarations of the elites and praised the countries for their progress on the way to Europe, while turning a blind eye to the fact that many of the reforms announced by pro-European governments actually never took place. Corruption and schemes and undemocratic politics was still in place. In Moldova and Georgia, the society is still not a civil society that the European politicians wanted to develop. It is said that family ties, the clan ties, are still much more important in those countries than any genuine economical interests, any political parties that were set up in those countries. And sadly, my feeling after visiting two of three countries and being in touch with people staying in the third one is that the three countries share not only a European dream, but also a feeling that nothing good can happen to them, and that immigration is perhaps the only way to make a personal life of a Ukrainian, Georgian, or Moldovan a little bit better. And while the elites of all the three countries are talking very willingly about the European dream, about their aspiration, about how Europe is incomplete without them, then for ordinary citizens, the European dream is just go to Europe to work, not to have too many obstacles on the way. And this is also the reason for which European integration is accepted and welcomed by most of the society. And so their European dream is to go to Europe and get their life a little bit better than it is in their homeland.
I wonder something. The EU tends to be very preferred by the middle classes everywhere, even in the Middle East, if you wish. The middle classes, it has appeal to the middle classes, and I guess it's similar with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. But I wonder in what ways could the EU contribute to larger segments of society, such as, for example, workers or self-employed, or I don't know, people who are in a more precarious position. What can they do beyond just emigrating? Are there some ways of empowerment for them?
Well, this is a tough question, and perhaps it would require from the EU to reform not only its Eastern policy, but the very philosophy of the European community. European officials praise Ukrainian, Moldovan, or Georgian progress in European integration. They focus on anti-corruption measures. They focus on the rule of law, fighting against oligarchy, fighting against the most obvious cases of democratic procedure violations. But you can very rarely hear that somebody from the European Union actually expresses any concerns about the society, the conditions in which the ordinary people live. So the European Union has been advocating privatization in Ukraine, even though it would mean a shock therapy. And we already saw results of shock therapies in Eastern Europe after 1989. Let me just remind that when, after Maidan, Ukraine formed its pro-European government. It consisted of Western Georgian, among others, experts who were standing for these liberal, ultra-liberal economy measures, and this was approved by the European Union. That was portrayed as the proper way. By the way, this was also portrayed as right direction of changes also in the case of Belarus. But here, as we all know, the European voice was thwarted by Lukashenko. So if European Union is the European Union must start caring more about something else than just formal democracy, than just rule of law and the procedures. But is it possible with European Union as we have it today?
Well, I suggest we make a special issue on that in certain moment, because we are now ending this first segment of the second episode, and we are continuing in the second segment where we discuss a very European concept, the one of strategic autonomy, with the Romanian professor of international relations, Sergiu Mişcoiu.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you. Share your comments. Subscribe to the channel. We are waiting for your feedback, and see you again. Hello again, and welcome to the second part of second episode of Cross Border Talks. We were very excited to see first followers appear after our first episode. We were also very excited to read your first impressions and get the first feedback. Thank you very much to everybody who shared his thoughts with us. So we are even more inspired to offer you an insightful information on Eastern Europe, and not only, comment on international relations beyond the stereotypes. And in today's episodes, we are going to embark on a hot topic that is the future of European Union, the possible reforms of European Union, and more specifically, what is the concept of strategic autonomy of the European Union? I'm serious. Vladimir will tell you in a minute what is it all about.
Yes, strategic autonomy of the EU is a concept which has been advancing for some time, and it became more important or more challenging, as especially in the context of the Trump presidency of the United States, which represented certain division between traditional strong Euro-Atlantic allies from both sides of the ocean. But also it is, I guess, provoked also by a number of other reasons, because the EU has been, it's been said for many times that the EU has strong economy, but politically it's not such a strong and independent geopolitical player. And in the case, for example, with the sanctions against Iran, in which the EU just couldn't do pretty much anything to circumvent them, and or a number of other issues, it is seen that the EU needs to somehow have its infrastructure or internal balances changed. And we have invited today a knowledgeable expert who can tell us and will discuss with us more about this concept of strategic autonomy of the EU. It is Sergiu Mişcoiu from Romania.
Hello, how do you do? I'm very glad to be with you today, and looking forward to chat with you and to answer your questions, to engage into a fruitful dialogue.
Thanks for coming.
Just for everybody to know, Sergiu is one of the top Romanian experts on European affairs. He is a professor of political science at the Faculty of European Studies at Bebes-Bolyai University in Cluj Napoca. He holds a PhD in political science and in history, so he has he's perfectly prepared to study populism, political transitions, which are actually among his main research interests. is also looking at the constructivist or alternative theories of nation-building processes. And so let us start from what actually is sovereign Europe, or what it could be. Mr. Mişcoiu, when French President Emmanuel Macron talks about sovereign Europe, what does he want to say precisely? And how much would the sovereign Europe would be different from this Europe that we know today? And how did this concept appear? Is this an attempt to rethink European relations with the external world? Is this only a reaction to Donald Trump's presidency, or is it a deeper geopolitical thought behind that?
Well, if we have to start backwards a little bit historically, we can see, of course, that strategic autonomy is a concept that was created back in the late 2000s, and it was first sketched in European documents by 2012-2013. And the main idea was back then to enforce as much as possible the ability of the European Union to defend itself and to project military power outside the European Union, more precisely in the neighborhood, in the close neighborhood of the European Union. Now, we have two concepts, this strategic autonomy on one hand, and then a concept that could be on one hand stronger, but in another perception weaker, which is European sovereignty. European sovereignty could mean that Europe is self-sufficient, it takes its own decisions. And of course, if we say European sovereignty, it means that Europe is the sovereign, and consequently, the nation states are, I wouldn't say the vassals of the European Union, but they are a part of common ground, a confederation that doesn't hold very much its name because it's something that the European leaders avoid to pronounce as a word. But this European sovereignty idea is closer to the idea of a European confederation, projecting power and also having a strong decision-making system that is let's say, overwhelming in comparison with its components, meaning the nation states. So on one hand, it's stronger than strategic autonomy because it doesn't refer only to the military side or the resilience side after the pandemics, but to a wider set of tools. And it has a meaning of enforcing something not necessarily over the exterior, like strategic autonomy suggests, but also towards the interior, meaning the nation states that will be, if we are frank, and we have to be frank, subordinated to the concept of European sovereignty.
So it looks like there are at least two major currents right now in the EU. One is the traditional autonomistic current, if I may say, and the other is this tendency which is for sovereignty or autonomy. And who are the countries on the one side and who are the countries on the other side? And also, how is this tendency developing right now? Given that in Trump times it might have been important to develop it, but with Biden, the relations between USA and EU seem to be getting better.
Yeah, as Malgorzata put it before, it's a French initiative. And we have to trace it again. It has something to do also with the traditional attitude of France within Europe, but also within NATO. France always wanted to differentiate itself and to be autonomous in its relations with the United States of America, under de Gaulle, under the following presidents also, and it never left this idea, which is to some extent legitimate, of having an important degree, a higher degree of autonomy within the security, international security framework. throughout time, France tried to define in a stronger or a more a smoother way this concept in such a way that it doesn't really hurt the feelings of the Atlanticists very much. And as you pointed out, President Macron used the opportunity of the Trump mandate in the United States of America to push forward this idea of autonomization of Europe in regard to NATO and to the transatlantic traditional relations. What does it mean? It means that the European Union should have, in a progressive way, the capacity of building itself such interoperational body of military assets, such as strategic kind of construction within its decision-making bodies, not only at the military level, but also at the diplomatic and political levels, in such a way that it could act not necessarily against, not necessarily even totally cut, but in a real autonomous way in regard with the United States of America. And the question is, of course, why France? Well, apart from this past that I just evoked, we do have a country which is the only country of the European Union, now with Britain being outside the European Union, with the capacity to project military power and to intervene in wide areas of the world. And if we take, for instance, Africa, of course, if it's the only European country able to intervene in an autonomous way, in a rapid way, in different theaters of operations in Africa, and other countries are really incapable to do so. And this could be replicated in other parts of the world to a lesser extent. So it's the only country having this pretension, this claim of leading, to some extent, a system of security that could be not necessarily, once again, in competition with the NATO arrangements, but let's say increasingly autonomous from the NATO arrangements.
Okay, but France is one country, and we have the European Union of 27 countries. So how are the other countries positioning with regard to this proposal?
Yeah, we do have two different views, and throughout time, France had different allies. It is now traditional already to consider that the southern flank of the European Union is closer to the French position. Italy, Spain, and to some extent Greece and other countries privileged throughout time this position of France. And in a rather opportunistic way, by case, some other countries joined the logic of France because they were able to lead some operations within this new framework that was the European security framework proposed by France and supported by other countries. On the other side, we do have Germany. Germany with a key strategic position, as we know, the economic champion of the European Union, and at the same time, the country that was always preoccupied of having, on one hand, a very close, stable, direct relation with the United States of America on the military ground, and at the same time, a large degree of autonomy, but in the case of Germany, as we can now follow even these days with the Nord Stream projects, a direct relation with other major players such as Russia. And of course, Germany was always preoccupied of keeping the NATO-driven security forces in Europe to do not allow too much autonomy for only European initiatives, I remember that by the mid-2010s, in different meetings of the European Union, German representatives always insisted that this concept should really not be so important, should really not be even put on the table, in order to not alienate too much the Americans from the European defense system. And to this position, we have also to add the position of several countries of Central and Eastern Europe, most notably Poland and Romania, very pro-Atlanticist, very much dependent on the security frameworks created by the United States of America, not really willing to go too far on this European construction of a strategic autonomy for, let's say, ideological, geopolitical reasons, and also for different reasons that are related to the power networks. I mean that we have a generation of leaders in these countries that are very much educated in, let's say, in the idea that the only force capable to defend Europe are the United States of America. The main danger comes from Russia, and in this framework, only NATO can really protect Eastern Europe, and not only NATO as a nebulous organization, but a NATO led by the United States with the support of other countries, smaller countries, and there is room for the Central and Eastern European countries, given their strategic position down there. So with small variations, we do have these two opposite versions of the issue of European strategic autonomy, and these continue to be today in debate, even if today we've got a commission, ironically led by a German, Mrs. von der Leyen, where the pro-strategic autonomy of the EU major leaders, such as Josep Borrell from Spain or Thierry Breton from France, are there and are very vocal. And so, ironically, now we have a German-led European Commission with a real discussion for the first time about the opportunity of strengthening the strategic autonomy of the EU.
I think Malgorzata will be curious about something for the external relations of the EU under this concept, if it is applied in full. But before that, let me just add here that the European Commission has been contemplating on a strategic document about so-called open strategic autonomy, and it should have been published in July, but it seems that it is getting delayed, and maybe it will appear in the autumn. And I guess that might be one sign that how can I say, the balances are always in a shift.
Yeah.
And I pass the baton to Malgorzata here.
Thank you, Vladimir. And before I do ask for external relations of the European Union, I must ask one question concerning my country, that is Poland, that was rightly mentioned as one of the most Euro-Atlanticist countries in Europe. And I really have nothing more to add to what you said about the generation of leaders. Yes, Polish leaders do believe that NATO is our only guarantee of security, that we must accept even more NATO forces in Polish territory, because this is our only way to be secure from aggression from the east. At the same time, the Polish government is worsening our relations with Brussels, and there are even concerns in Poland on the Polish opposition that we may be excluded from the European Union for continuous breaking the rules of the community. Is it possible that On one hand, Europe will go towards bigger sovereignty, and on the other hand, such countries as Poland excluded from the community.
Well, it would be a catastrophic scenario, and I'm very sure that the delays Vladimir told us about in pushing forward some policy strategic documents that are vital for a wider concept of strategic autonomy. These delays are due to the fact that people in Brussels do realize that if the national feelings of the Poles, the Hungarians, but also of other Central and European leaders are hurt, then it will be increasingly difficult to promote the concept and to keep Europe all together to put it in a nutshell. So this distancing of the Polish, the Hungarian, but also the Slovenian now leaders, to some extent also the Austrian leaders from the hardcore of the European Union is due to the fact that, of course, there is a matter of ideology and the views about what human rights are, what are the principles of organization of a democratic state, are different and are increasingly different. They clashed only now, but there was an accumulation throughout time of these differences, and we have to admit it. And they coincide in a quite tricky way with this view according to which we need power politics to defend ourselves, and the only capable power in the Western world to promote power politics is the United States of America. The other organizations and the other alliances or the other countries, including the European Union, are simply too weak to promote such a power politic. The attitude of Russia under Putin, of course, strengthened this impression of the Eastern leaders that there is no other shelter but the US-led shelter there. And more we advanced, more these signs of a need of strong action coming from a classical kind of power were there. And that's why, and I will stop immediately to allow you to ask other questions. That's why we do have within the European Commission, but also within the strategic documents of the European Union, an increasing preoccupation towards acquiring elements of hard power. Really, the European Union was considered to be too soft, and now it needed to become stronger, to act in a stronger way. And if you allow me, I will quote the German president Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who said the European Union is a herbivorous form of geopolitical organization in a carnivorous world. This says everything about soft versus hard power in the view of the new leaders of the European Union. And so we can expect this debate to go onwards.
Okay, and now let us stop for a moment on external relations of the European Union, supposedly after it actually strengthens its autonomy, and if this conception of making Europe more sovereign actually gets some form. Recently, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron insisted on meeting with Vladimir Putin, and the Chancellor of Germany said that if there are problems with Russia, then in her opinion, the best way to solve them is in talks. And Poland and Baltic states were categorically against any meeting, and so finally it did not take place. But I am wondering if the European Union's policy towards Russia will not change anyway, if the concept of strategic Europe is being put into place. And also on this occasion, I wanted to ask about yet another direction of external relations of Europe, that ones with Africa and the whole question of migration. You said that the south flank of Europe is supporting French projects. So I can imagine they would like a more active European Union policy on its borders. So what can we expect?
Well, from the relation with Russia, from this point of view, the situation is very complex because we've got national policies in most countries in relation with Russia. We said that we've got very Atlanticist states in the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and others. We do have countries working a little bit à la carte and trying to negotiate directly, such as Germany. We do have Hungary, and from this point of view, it's very different from the case of Poland because Hungary is now some sort of a semi-ally of Russia because of mainly of ideological issues, but not only. And Russia finds a very fertile land in the neoconservatist politics of Hungary. And then we've got states that are really doubting about the capacity of the European Union itself to be very firm in the relations with Russia. And of course, Russia has always speculated this. It does it now more than before, but it always tried to speculate these uncertainties and this reluctance towards a union of the EU in order to fragilize the unity of the European Union and to play in a legitimate way from its point of view its card on the European table. So I believe that, of course, if this concept of strategic autonomy will increase, then we will still have a debate if this concept is applicable mainly in the relations between the United States and NATO on one hand and the EU on the other, or it's applicable also in the case of a unitary Europe against an imperialist or a neo-imperialist Russia. And things are really not clear from this point of view. With regard to Africa, I just ended an interesting research with lots of interviews with African officials on their precisely on this topic, the impression that they have about the new strategy of the European Union. Will this affect the image of the European Union? Is Europe now a soft power? Is a Gentile friend trying to cope, to work directly with the African leaders in a win-win kind of framework, a much more, let's say, softer power, really preoccupied by development and less preoccupied by enforcing rules as before. And the results are quite complex to interpret it. It means that we've got an opening of the African leaders towards the new Europe, and at the same time we've got a demand for a stronger Europe. Those guys there believe that we've got big powers such as China, US, Brazil even, and of course the United States of America. And then we've got a mosaic of European powers with different interests. If the European Union will be able to promote this new image in a successful way, a softer power in partnership with the African states, then there is a wide room to penetrate on a fast-growing market, on a fastly developing set of countries from the demographic point of view, and a land with lots of threats, but also with huge opportunities in terms of investments and in terms of the future of the world, in terms of resources, in terms of betting on something that will in the future grow. and this is quite popular among the new leaders of the European Commission, I mean the new Commission of Ursula von der Leyen, to believe that Europe has to invest and has to be pragmatic in this new relation. So I'm more optimistic about what could be done in Africa than what could be the position of the EU in relation with the closer and the most ferocious Russia.
Okay, and finally, we ask you to make some kind of prognosis about what will be following in the near future. Obviously, the two currents, the Atlanticist and the autonomist, will continue to coexist. But what can we expect from their balances? And finally, also, what does the affirmation of the autonomist current mean for the internal balances in the EU, for its reforms? What will change in the EU in other regards, such as social or economic, if this concept gets stronger?
Finally, there is a debate between the Atlanticists and the autonomists to some extent, but this debate has to be nuanced. For instance, in 2017, the European Union created the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, mechanism within the European Union. And of course, Germany at the beginning was a little bit reluctant, but since 2019, it has cooperated with France on different operational grounds, and it was a success. This PESCO was led by the Netherlands, so a country that is close to also the United States, but has its own, let's say, claims to lead something within the European Union. And to some extent, PESCO, even if it's not really 100% a success, it's a mechanism that it... On the other hand, we've got within NATO the framework nations concept, another initiative, this time coming from inside NATO, meant to, let's say, or make more relative this cleavage within the EU between the Atlanticists and the autonomists. And within this FNC, Framework Nations concept, there have been some advancements in co-working, in interoperability between the forces of NATO and the forces of the European Union, with Germany being happy, and this is something that has to be noticed, because if Germany is happy, things go on within the European Union on the military ground, and not only on the military ground. So it means that we have maybe in the end to de-dramatize a little bit this clash between the two views over the European security, and to witness the fact that, to acknowledge the fact that there are series of constructions of interinstitutional experiments, and some of them are really working. So, I mean, when we have this big picture of the clash of titans, we lose the nuanced, more refined sub-image of what happens on the ground. And on the ground, there are cases of successful interoperational frameworks that in the end will push maybe forward the cooperation and will reduce this need for a single, well-stated, undoubtful autonomy of the EU from NATO. I think because of the simple fact that lots of Europeans do believe that it is not really feasible, that in the end there should be a continuous cooperation and dialogue between NATO and the EU. Otherwise, the security of Europe will be endangered. I don't say that this is necessarily my point of view, but I think that this view is quite majority in the European Union. And that's why I think that smaller experiments, like in the beginnings of the European construction with the coal and steel communities, if you recall, this kind of small kind of experiments will lead necessarily to a more flexible and more operational institutions and practices. And of course, in the end, I have to stress the only way to test all these is to see them at work. So if there will be an intervention, if there will be a need for working and applying these, let's say, trainings that these troops have and this entire concept of security has in practice, and if it will work, things will advance much faster than they are now. So I'm not that pessimistic about the future of this cooperation between NATO structures and EU structures within the European security framework.
Okay, Sergiu, thank you for your coming to our program, and thanks to our listeners and viewers for watching.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I will be glad to return.
We remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we are open to your comments, remarks, questions, and suggestions for future episodes. And I also would like to thank Sergiu for being with us, for saying things that they are not easily heard in mainstream media who simplify things. So once again, thank you very much, and see you again.